Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We're diving into some pretty choppy waters today.
Definitely choppy, yeah.
Some serious waves being made in the world of global trade, and it all comes down to this. The Trump administration hitting the gas on some huge tariffs.
Big tariffs. 25% on all those foreign cars coming in.
Oof, that's a lot.
And then another 10% tacked on to just about everything else we import.
So basically, stuff's about to get more expensive.
Potentially, yeah. And that's just scratching the surface. We've got a whole stack of news articles and official transcripts for this deep dive, breaking down the announcement itself, the administration's reasoning, and of course, all those reactions. Global, domestic, lots to unpack.
Absolutely. And that's what we're here for, right?
Right.
We want to get past those flashy headlines and really grasp why these tariffs are being imposed, see what's happening on the ground, both here and abroad.
Immediate impact, sure. But we also want to look ahead, to the bigger debates, the potential long-term consequences, all of that.
Exactly. So let's start with the why. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick has been the administration's point person on this. What's the core argument?
Well, from what Lutnick's saying, it boils down to two big things.
Okay, Dayami.
One, national security.
Right, that's been a recurring theme.
Two, the trade deficit. Huge problem, they say.
Okay, so let's dig into that national security piece first. Lutnick's basically painting a picture of the U.S. as dangerously reliant on foreign countries, right?
Yeah. He specifically called out medicine, ships, steel, and aluminum, even semiconductors, the essential stuff.
And the argument is that this reliance, this dependence, is a risk.
A huge risk in their eyes. They're saying it makes us vulnerable. Like in a time of crisis, a real international conflict, or just, serious global instability.
We're stuck, right?
Pretty much. If those supply chains get disrupted, we're suddenly cut off from vital meds, critical tech, materials for, defense systems, all of it.
It does make you think, right? Like, how much do we take for granted?
Totally.
Yeah.
We flip a switch, the lights come on, we buy a phone, it just works. But all those components, those raw materials, they come from all over the world.
And that's fine when things are stable, but
when they're not, that's when those long, complex supply chains can become a liability, a weakness.
Okay, point taken. Now, what about this trade deficit?
Okay, so Lutnick throws out this number, $1.2 trillion. That's the size of the U.S. trade deficit.
Wow.
Meaning we're importing way more than we're exporting. And his argument is that this imbalance is basically other countries earning our money, taking it out of our economy.
And leading to, I think you mentioned this, foreign ownership of U.S. assets.
Exactly. $18 trillion worth, to be precise. That's how much foreign entities own here in the U.S. net.
Which, I gotta ask, what does that even mean, practically speaking? Like, if a country owns assets in another country, what does that look like on the ground?
That's a great question, actually. A really important one. Does it give them undue influence? Does it affect economic decision-making? How much leverage does it provide in, say, international negotiations? There are a lot of perspectives on that, a lot of different economic theories.
It's complex, for sure. But ultimately, the administration's goal with these tariffs is, what, a total reset?
They're calling it reindustrialization. The idea is to make American-made goods more competitive, bring manufacturing back home.
So by making imports more expensive.
You encourage businesses to produce here, invest here, hire here. Lutnick specifically talks about creating these advanced automated factories, requiring a highly skilled American workforce, mechanics, electricians, all that.
Promises.
Huge promises. Trillions in new investment. The greatest resurgence of jobs, he actually said.
Bold claims. We'll see how that plays out. But I gotta say, the immediate reaction wasn't exactly mission accomplished.
Not quite. You're right. One article called it absolute panic in the global markets. Yeah. The U.S. stock market took a massive hit. Like $6 trillion in value wiped out in just 2 days after the announcement.
That's a lot of money. And not just, for Wall Street types. That kind of shockwave ripples out.
Oh, absolutely. Your 401k, retirement funds, investments, people feel that it creates uncertainty.
For sure. And it also tends to trigger a response, right? I mean, other countries don't just sit back and take it.
Nope. We've already seen China firing back. They slapped tariffs on pretty much every American product coming in.
Tit for tat.
Classic retaliatory tariffs. And it's not just China. Canada's gearing up to do the same. And we're hearing rumblings from others, too. They're not happy. For instance, we heard from Senator Cantwell, who was talking about Washington State's apple growers. They got hit hard by Chinese tariffs a few years back. It really illustrates how these broad trade policies can have such specific, real-world consequences for certain industries and regions.
Makes sense. If you're suddenly locked out of a major export market, that's going to hurt.
Big time. And the sources indicate that something like 50 countries have been ringing up the White House, voicing their concerns.
So a lot of diplomatic scrambling going on behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah. And the potential fallout. They're talking about higher prices for consumers, disrupted supply chains. Businesses rely on those intricate networks to get things made, shipped, sold. All of a sudden, those get thrown into chaos.
And then there's a whole question of American businesses trying to compete globally.
Right. If our goods are more expensive because of all these tariffs, it makes it tougher to sell them overseas. Less competitive.
Definitely a lot to consider there. But shifting gears now to the domestic scene, these tariffs have really kicked off a debate here in the U.S.
A big one. And it comes down to this: the balance of power between the president and Congress. Specifically, who gets to call the shots on trade policy?
Right. You've got folks like Senator Barrasso saying Trump is well within his rights, that these tariffs are a tool, a legitimate tool, to push back against, what he sees as unfair trade practices by countries like China.
All right, that's one side. But then you've got pushback from some unexpected corners. Even within the Republican Party, people like Senators Cruz and Paul are expressing concerns.
About what, specifically?
Well, they're worried about these tariffs essentially becoming a tax on American consumers. Prices go up, people have less money to spend, it could hurt the economy. Plus, they're pointing to historical examples where protectionist policies, trying to shield domestic industries, have actually led to economic downturns. It's a real clash of economic philosophies.
So a real ideological divide there, but it's not just talk, right? There's actual legislation in the works.
Yeah, Senator Cantwell, a Democrat, is leading the charge. And she's got some bipartisan support, too. Folks like Congressman Bacon are on board.
Interesting. And what's the gist of this legislation?
Basically, it would require Congress to sign off on any tariffs that are imposed for longer than 60 days. So, no more unilateral action by the president, more oversight, more checks and balances.
Which gets to the heart of this long-standing constitutional question, right? Congress has the power to levy taxes and tariffs. It's right there in the Constitution. But over time, the executive branch has, accrued more and more power in this area. So it's this constant back and forth. Who really gets to set the rules of the game when it comes to global trade?
And it gets even more complicated when you factor in other economic policies like the recent tax cuts. Senator Barrasso actually described these tariffs as part of a comprehensive economic plan.
So everything's connected, they're saying.
That's the argument.
Okay.
But then you've got the chair of the Federal Reserve basically saying, hold on, these tariffs could actually fuel inflation, which would, of course, undermine some of those tax cut benefits. So it's this question of, are these policies working together or are they at odds? The real test will be what happens to consumer prices, how much things actually cost people in their everyday lives.
Yeah, that's what people feel most directly. Now, it's not just the economic side of things we have to consider. These tariffs have also caused some ripples internationally.
Definitely. NATO Secretary General Rutte openly admitted there are tensions between the allies because of these tariffs.
Makes sense. Even if those defense commitments stay solid, you got to figure there's some strain on those relationships, right?
Oh, for sure. Especially when a major economic player like the U.S. starts throwing up barriers like this, it adds a whole other layer of complexity.
It's happening against the backdrop of this whole Ukraine situation, the U.S. pushing for a peace deal, maybe trying to mend fences with Russia.
Which a lot of NATO allies are watching with a lot of anxiety. They're worried it could undermine that Western unity, which has been so crucial in confronting Russian aggression. It's a delicate balancing act, to say the least.
It really is. So beyond the immediate economic impact, the administration's argument, as we heard from Lutnick, is that there's a deeper strategic and national security rationale behind these tariffs.
Right. It all goes back to reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, becoming more self-sufficient, less vulnerable.
Makes sense on the surface. But then you have folks like Congressman Bacon voicing concerns about the recent dismissal of top NSA officials.
Yeah, that's a big one. His argument is that weakening our intelligence capabilities could actually make us less safe, not more. So there's real debate there about whether these moves are actually strengthening or undermining national security.
It's complicated. And you also have NATO Secretary General Reid emphasizing the growing military power of China.
Which is something we can't ignore.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, look, we need a unified Western strategy to deal with this challenge. And these trade disputes, they don't exactly help in that regard. They can create friction, sow discord, at a time when we need to be working together.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, so let's get into some of the nitty-gritty, some of the more interesting details that came up in your research. First off, Lutnick was adamant that these tariffs aren't just a negotiating tactic.
Oh, yeah, he was pretty firm on that. He said they're here to stay for days and weeks.
Which, isn't exactly a precise timeline. Could be a while.
Could be. Another thing that caught my eye was this whole business about Heard Island and McDonald Islands. You ever heard of them?
Can't say I have.
Tiny little territories way out in the middle of nowhere. But Lutnick specifically included them on the tariff list.
Why?
To close loopholes, he said. Apparently, there was concern that these remote spots could be used to, route goods through and avoid the tariffs. So they're really trying to cover all their bases, no stone unturned.
Thorough. I'll give them that. And what about this whole idea of American workers? Lutnick seems to have a lot of faith in their skills, even acknowledging that, labor costs here can be higher.
Yeah, he made a point of saying American workers are simply better. And he painted this picture of these future automated factories, very high-tech, but still requiring skilled American labor to run them. Mechanics, electricians, that kind of thing.
So a vision of a high-tech, made-in-America future. We'll see. It's important to keep the timeline of all this in mind.
Absolutely. First, the tariff announcements, then that immediate market sell-off, all that red on Wall Street.
It's not a good look.
Then the retaliatory tariffs from China, others likely to follow. And now we're heading into congressional hearings where they'll be grilling everyone, really getting into the weeds on the legal and economic implications of all this.
High drama. And a lot of players in this whole saga, right? You've got Trump and Lutnick driving the policy, Barrasso defending it, Cantwell trying to rein it in.
Don't forget Congressman Bacon raising those national security red flags. And then you've got Root on the international stage trying to hold the NATO alliance together amidst all this economic turmoil. A real cast of characters.
Definitely. And Senator Cantwell also pointed out something interesting. The relative silence from the business community. You'd think they'd be up in arms, but there hasn't been a huge outcry.
Right, and that in itself is kind of telling. Maybe they're hesitant to publicly criticize the administration, worried about repercussions. But that lack of vocal opposition from the business world, it speaks volumes.
It does. And then, of course, you have that whole thing with the NSA officials being dismissed, which, as Congressman Bacon pointed out, adds another layer of uncertainty to this whole situation. It's all connected. The economic, the political, the national security, it's all intertwined.
Definitely. So, to recap, these tariffs are a big deal. A major shift in U.S. trade policy, driven by the administration's anxieties about national security and that persistent trade deficit.
And the immediate fallout. Global markets took a nosedive, international allies are on edge, and here at home, a debate is raging not just about the economic wisdom of these tariffs, but about the very foundation of who gets to make these decisions, the president or Congress.
You've now got a much clearer view of this complex web of economic, political, and international forces at play. But here's a final thought for you to ponder. In a world so deeply interconnected, a world where economics and national security are so intertwined, how might these tariffs reshape the geopolitical landscape in the years to come? What unexpected consequences might we see unfold? And what new questions does this deep dive raise for you about the future of global trade and the delicate dance of international alliances?
Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. See you next time.